Hello, everybody. My name is Carlos Martinez, and I am a climate scientist at the National Center for Atmospheric Research, and I also chair the American Meteorological Society's COSMOS, or the Committee on Spirituality, Multifaith Outreach, and Science. We are delighted for you all to be here today, whether you are an AMS member or part of the public who is interested in this fascinating and exciting conversation. Before we get started, just wanted to share some insights. The AMS is a professional society consisting of approximately 11,000 members in the weather, water, and climate community. And Cosmos, we seek to do a lot of bridge building with spiritual and faith-based communities. We have over 50 members of various spiritual identities, non-AMS and AMS members, who come together to facilitate dialogue between spiritual faith-based communities and the weather, water, and climate enterprise. One of our exciting activities is a webinar series known as the Finding Common Ground Among Science, Spirituality, and Environmentalism, which several of our previous webinars are available through the AMS website. We're excited that this webinar before you today is part of that series, where we have a priest and a climate scientist walking into this very webinar to have a discussion on their friendship and on the importance of their desire in climate activism as well, and their commitment to social change respective to their knowledge systems. Before we get started, I wanted to share some logistics with all of you. This is a reminder that you being present here, you are adhering to the AMS Code of Conduct, and a link will be provided before you through the chat box. And then also a quick timeline. We'll have a very quick introduction from both panelists, and then we'll have a panel discussion. And then at the conclusion of the webinar, about 15 minutes till the top of the hour, we'll have a Q&A where you have the opportunity to ask any questions to our panelists. Please note, if you do have a question, feel free to add it through the chat box on the question box, and we will read that out towards the end. Okay, so without further ado, I'm going to introduce our panelists today. We have first is Reverend Sally Bingham. Her and then Dr. Peter Frumhoff, they will share a quick introduction, and then we'll get started with the panel discussion. So first I'll leave it to you, Reverend Sally. We see you, and if you'd like to share your initial introduction.
Well, now you can see me. Can you hear me as well?
Yep, you are good to go.
Okay, thanks, Carlos. I am the Reverend Canon Sally Bingham. I'm a priest in the Episcopal Diocese of California, and I was ordained just about 30 years ago, 1997 it was. And I've retired from the Interfaith Power and Light program that I used to run and was also the founder of, but I still work at Grace Cathedral as an assisting priest. So I'm doing weddings and baptisms and some funeral services, which I don't relish very much, but I'm still an active priest at Grace Cathedral. But I don't work day to day on the Interfaith Power and Light program, which I'm going to describe to you a little later. But I live in San Francisco, and it's a beautiful day out here today, and I welcome everybody on the webinar.
Great, thanks so much, Sally. Now I'd like to introduce everyone to Dr. Peter. Peter.
Carlos, thanks so much, and thanks to you and AMS and the Cosmos Initiative for hosting this conversation. I'm really delighted to join you all. So I'm Peter Frumhoff. I'm a global change ecologist, a climate scientist. I teach and do work at the nexus of climate science and policy. I currently teach at Harvard University. I'm also the senior science policy advisor at the Woodwell Climate Research Center, which is an NGO based in Woods Hole, Massachusetts, that does really important work at the climate science and policy nexus. For many years, I was the chief climate scientist and director of science and policy at the Union of Concerned Scientists, which is based in Cambridge, Massachusetts, which is where I live, which is, for some of you may not know, is a national nonprofit that works again to bring science to bear on informing public policy across a range of issues, including predominantly climate change. And it's in that context that I met Sally. We'll talk a little bit more about our relationship in a moment. I just wanted to say that my role here on this webinar, which I'm thrilled to be here, is in addition to my kind of, not really about my technical expertise, it's about my relationship and friendship with Sally. I've long been an admirer and colleague of Sally, and a real believer in the work that she and others have done to build a really powerful coalition of faith leaders working actively on climate activism, climate policy through interfaith power and light. So I'm delighted to be here with you all.
Great, thank you. Thank you for both of your introductions. And again, on behalf of AMS and with Cosmos, we're so delighted for each of you to be here and share your friendship and your wisdom for all of us here. So now we'll get started with the panel discussion, and I'll start it off with Reverend Sally. As you mentioned earlier, you just described how you founded Interfaith Power and Light. If you could share, how did you start that? What did that look like? And specifically, how did you and your colleagues build a multi-spiritual coalition to tackle environmental issues such as climate change?
Well, that's an involved question, but let me start with the fact that I was invited to be on the National Board of Environmental Defense Fund the same year that my husband and 3 children and I moved from New York to San Francisco. And I joined an Episcopal church, which was my faith, although I was not a zealot. I was a sort of average church attender. And what was bothering me is that at the EDF board meetings, which happen 3 times a year, I was learning what humans were doing to the planet. And at that time, and this is in the 80s, early 80s, it was overfishing, it was lead and gasoline, it was deforestation, it was antibiotics fed to poultry. All of the issues that we now really know seriously about, EDF was telling people and giving us that information. Well, then I would go to the Episcopal Church and be sitting in a pew professing my love for God and my love for creation. And we were asked, one of the 10 commandments is to love your neighbor as yourself. Well, it just was stirring in me that if you love your neighbor, why would you pollute your neighbor's air? And why would you not do everything you could to keep creation intact and healthy and sacred as it is? So I asked the rector of our church why he didn't talk about care for creation from the pulpit. And he had 2 sons that were river guides. So I figured he would probably know what was happening in the Colorado River and where the water was going and whether there were droughts or floods. And he did not want to touch that subject. It was seen at that time as a political issue and not something that a priest talks about from the pulpit. And in fact, when I asked friends of mine, nobody had heard, whatever religion it was, whether it was Jewish or Muslim or Catholic or Lutheran or Episcopalian, nobody had ever heard a minister or priest talk about creation care from the pulpit. And so I was pushing this at my rector. I kept saying, why isn't this something that we're embracing? It seems to me the religious community should lead this movement. Well, he said, look, why don't you go to seminary and find out where the disconnect is between what we say we believe in and how we behave. So I ran down to Bishop Swing, who was, Bishop William Swing was the Bishop of California at that time. And I said, I want to go to seminary and find out where this disconnect is. And in the course of the conversation, he said, well, where'd you go to college? Well, I hadn't been to college, so I had to tell him that I had never gone to college. And Bishop Swing said, you can't go and get a master's degree until you go to college. So I was disappointed, but I thought, okay, if I have to go to college, I had 1 child in college, actually 2 children in college, and 1 who was in the 3rd grade here in San Francisco. So I had the time, I had the energy, and I could pay the tuition. So I entered the University of San Francisco. Now that happens to be a very fine Jesuit school. So I went there, I entered as a freshman, I was 45 years old, and in 4 years I graduated, still having gone to EDF board meetings. And by this time I was connected to the Union of Concerned Scientists, where Peter was working at that time. And the information was overwhelming, and people were even talking about climate change at that time. So I go back to Bishop's Wing and I said, all right, I've graduated from college. Can I go to seminary now? And yes, and I entered seminary. I spent 3 years in seminary, and then they put me out in a church to work as a seminarian, and all I talked about was the environment. But people received that message very openly and genuinely cared. So one thing led to another. We started a commission for the environment for the Diocese of California, and I was put in charge of it, which is, I'm now, when I told you I was a canon, I'm a canon for the environment in the Diocese of California. And then our commission decided we've got to address climate change. That's going to be our subject. So Episcopal Power and Light was born, and that was in the year 2000. And then the Wall Street Journal did an article on what California was doing and what the religious community was doing around climate and renewable energy. We were pushing renewable energy at that time. And in California, the renewable energy people had come into the market. The company, it was called Green Mountain Energy. We were taking it to all our Episcopal churches in the whole state. The Wall Street Journal did an article on this, and Michael Northrup, who was at the Rockefeller Brothers Foundation, got in touch with me and said, hey, if we funded you, could you take this national? And this story can go on and on and on. And eventually where we are today with 22,000 congregations involved in all different denominations, this was really, I would say, powered by the Holy Spirit. It's very definitely an organic organization. It created itself almost. And I would hate to say or try to have anyone believe that this was an idea that I had 30 years ago or 25 years ago, that we would start climate discussions in the religious community. It happened because it was supposed to happen, and I was in the right place at the right time. And now we have all these different denominations. You asked me, Carlos, how did these other denominations get involved? Well, they came to us. We got a call from the synagogue out in Oakland shortly after we started Episcopal Power and Light, asking if this was just for Episcopalians or could other denominations join. Well, we said it's for everybody. And so it really created itself, came on its own, and it's now a national organization with, as I said, there are 22,000 congregations and 40 states involved. That we have individual state programs, and then they all work together and communicate with one another. But I think that's enough of how it started. If there's a specific question on it, somebody can ask that at the end.
Well, great. No, that's fantastic. Thank you for sharing. And it's wonderful to see the organic nature of a movement like this to build the network that it has today. And we're so thankful to have the continued partnership with Interfaith Power and Light through the American Meteorological Society when we discuss important issues like climate change. Great. We'll head to our next question here, and this is for both of you, which is, how did you both meet? How did this friendship form with one another that has fostered over the years?
Well, I'm happy to kick that off, and then Sally can fill in the pieces. We met, actually, I guess now I realize, just after you formed Episcopal Power and Light in the early 2000s, because it was in 2002. Sally and I, as it turns out, were both invited to spend a week at a Catholic monastery in Kentucky, which for me, as a person raised as a Reformed Jew, was something I never expected to spend my time at. It was fascinating. It was at Gethsemane, which was the place where monastery where Thomas Merton was a monk, and where he wrote and engaged in social activism as a theologian. As a Catholic theologian, and the Thomas Merton Society, which sought to carry on much of his work, held a retreat, a week-long retreat on spirituality and the environment. And I was privileged to be invited there. At the time, UCS was doing, Union of Concerned Scientists, we were doing our work in a very specific science policy frame. So for me to have an opportunity to reflect, which is what we did during the week, and talk with folks, and most importantly, as it turns out for me in hindsight, was to meet Sally and form a friendship and relationship that's lasted ever since, and to inform not just my thinking, but I think the work of the Union of Concerned Scientists as we then developed a number of partnerships with faith communities over the years. So that's how we met, and it's been really exciting to see how Interfaith Power and Light has grown, both in size and power. I can use that word advisedly, power to influence and inform and motivate change on climate policy and climate understanding. And Sally, I don't know if you want to fill in any more blanks on how we met, but I'll leave it there.
Well, that is the story of where we met. And then over the years, Peter would come out to do presentations with the Union of Concerned Scientists. And I would always be asking, I remember you were so gracious with your answers, because I think at the time my questions were probably pretty stupid, but I couldn't talk to religious leaders about climate change unless I knew some of the details. I had to have some facts. And I know when I would say to when I went back to that original priest and said, look, here's what's happening with the climate, he would say, I can't talk about 350 parts per million or where it is, because I don't have the information. So I could go back to Peter or UCS and get brochures on sea rise and what was happening, and then provide that information to people who were trying to learn more about it. And that connection, which is why we're having this conversation now, that connection between religion and science is very important, because you can't have somebody stand up in a pulpit and talk about climate change unless they can sort of defend what they're saying at coffee hour when people start asking questions. So Peter could provide information for me. And we also, you came and spoke, Peter, at one of the events that I had in Palo Alto. You were visiting Stanford University. I think you were at Stanford, and you came over one evening and we had a conversation on this subject. But when I talked about climate, I could turn to Peter and say, now you do the facts. I'll talk about the religious response and what do we do as people of faith. But what you give them the facts on what's really happening. And so we did that a few times in congregations, and then, you know, over time, I began to learn some of the facts myself, but I'd still have to have them checked out by a scientist. So that, and those occasions happened often enough that our friendship grew.
Yeah, I love hearing that there are things that we can learn from one another with our different knowledges and value systems. And that's actually the next question for both of you, which is when we consider environmentalism, when we talk about climate change and other issues that impact all of us, what can scientists and faith leaders learn from one another? And what can each do better, whether that's communication, whether that's relationship building, etc.
Well, I'm happy to take a first cut at that and offer a couple of thoughts. Thanks for it, Carlos. And I want to say kind of at the get-go that I am not, and Kelly can speak for herself, I am by no means an expert in a scholarly sense of the relation between science and faith and how these communities interact. There are many people, both as scientists and as faith leaders, who have done deep scholarly dives into this space, and that is certainly not me. So I want to just represent that honestly and clearly as I respond to this question. But, you know, I think as Sally spoke to turning to scientists, myself and many others, to provide facts that she could then bring to her community, both leaders and congregants. In my view, that's essential, but it's also implicitly, at least, not just bringing the facts that science can provide, but also validating that trusting science, right, to inform us, that science as a way of knowing the world, not the way, but a way, an important way of knowing the world, is valuable, is essential in order to make informed evidence-based choices about what we do as a society on many things, not just on climate, but on so many other issues, on vaccines, on issues that are often treated as controversial with respect to science, even when they're not, and providing, having faith leaders who can speak honestly and clearly and openly, not just to the facts, but to partner with scientists and understand that science as a way of knowing is legitimate for many reasons. It's not just a collection of facts. It's a social process of continually testing ideas and scrutinizing results in a community of experts that brings us to understand things at a level where consensus bodies like the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change or the national academies can provide information that we understand to be robust and legitimate and essential to make informed choices. Saying that one doesn't have to be a scientist to say that, but or you don't have to work as a scientist to be able to say that, but to validate that in the context of a larger nation and set of communities, including faith communities, where science is often treated as a kind of uncertain when it's really not, or the uncertainties are treated as reasons not to act when they're not. And so Sally's leadership in that space has been really essential. I think scientists, to turn it around to the other part of your question, Carlos, we have to find ways to be comfortable, not just speaking to the facts, but speaking to our values. Because we choose what to study based on our values. We care for creation. We think about, we may not always put it in faith-based terms, but we have values that drive our work, that inform the kinds of research we do, and our urgency for wanting to see action being taken. I think there's a lot that those of us in the scientific community can gain, have really gained over the years, to gain comfort in being clear that we don't have to just stick to the facts, but that we can also speak to our values about what needs to be done. Mario Molina, a very famous atmospheric chemist, Nobel Prize winner, who had discovered with Sherry Rowland and others, the fact that chlorofluorocarbons were destroying the ozone layer back in the 1970s, often said, as he spoke out about the risks of the declining ozone, that it was important for scientists to speak out, not just about the facts, but about our values, but to be clear when we're speaking about one and not the other, to separate them out so we're not conflating facts and values. Faith leaders have a lot to model for us about how to do that, and I think many scientists are doing that more effectively now because of our partnerships with Sally and many others in the faith community. I'll stop there.
I'd like to add something, Carlos. Can I do that?
Yeah, feel free.
Peter, do you remember when Carl Sagan invited religious leaders and scientists to go to Washington? I was included in that through Senator Worth and Senator Hines. They were part of getting religious leaders, politicians, and scientists together. And one of the things that Carl Sagan said, who, as you know, is a well-known scientist who's since deceased, but he made it quite clear that this climate problem was a very, very serious issue, but that scientists themselves, and this is now 30 years ago, are not particularly good communicators when it comes to talking to the average people about what's happening. And he said, we need the religious community to communicate this information. And I was there for that, and that really stuck with me, because I do think that if religious peoples are the ones that sit in the pews, profess a love for God, and say we love our neighbors, then we should be leading this movement on climate. And if scientists know how serious this issue is, and you're going to know far more the seriousness than a priest or a rabbi is, then help us communicate that. I mean, that's where I think this connection is so important, is to give us the information that we can then put into lay people's language and make it a spiritual issue. Because what we've discovered over the years is that the religious community has had a very substantial influence on persuading people all over the country that this climate is changing due to our bad behavior. And I think that that's important to know. And so, I mean, I really thank the scientific community for giving us the information. I do think through people like Stephen Schneider and the Stephen Schneider Award that's given out every year to a scientist who's a good communicator has helped the scientific community move into a more, I don't know what a word is for better communication, but able to get this information into lay people's hearts and minds.
Well, great point said. And I know from an AMS perspective, and as a young adult, that's super important. There's so many people in youth who really want to not just understand what's going on with the science currently and the physical reality there, but also how to communicate. You know, what are tools and resources that I and others can have to learn how to communicate to different audiences with different ways of knowing, for example, in building those relationships. As oftentimes I see, for example, science can sometimes be very transactional, and there are other ways of knowing that are very relationship based. It's not a one and done thing. It takes time, and there's a desire to get to know the person, not just the scientist. So thank you for sharing those points. And for anyone out there in the audience, again, if you have any questions, we already have some coming in. Just know we'll ask those questions towards the latter end of the webinar. But another question I have similarly to this is, you know, our audience has folks who are part of the weather, water, climate community who might be interested in working with their local faith leader, for example, or they see an interest in the value of working with spiritual and faith communities. What do you both feel and think about scientists and faith leaders working together if there is a shared value system like climate activism or environmentalism? What advice do you both have for folks here today who might be interested in doing something similarly to the friendship that you both share?
Sally, you want to kick it off, or?
Well, no, do you have any thoughts about that? I'm not.
Well, just a couple. I mean, there's no magic bullet here to lift up. I think there are plenty of volunteer opportunities often at very local levels. Sally and I talked about giving talks together. I am by no means hugely active in this space, but I've given several talks at local interfaith or Jewish or other opportunities within my zip code or zip codes within my state in Massachusetts. There are many, whether it's the Massachusetts Power and Light as an organization that often brings people together, for example, at a state level, as there are chapters I understand in other states as well, but also just within the synagogue I belong to, or others. I got, if I'm known as a resource and make myself known as a resource, and people are grappling with climate change, what to do, often at a local level, but want some broader context to understand, how they should think about the urgency or the opportunities to take action, often coupled with information about clean energy and other more specific policy issues, right? Because people need that information too, not just, if you will, the climate science. So there have been many opportunities that I've found, and really they kind of come to me. But I think if you're not finding them come to you, there are ways to just, make phone calls and make yourself available. And I'm sure that would be, I'm sure many people in the audience and in the AMS community have already found that to be the case.
I want to add just one thing. There's an international figure who understands how this all works with science and faith, the ecumenical patriarch Bartholomew, who is head of the big Greek Orthodox Church. I don't know how lately he's had an event, but he would have symposiums on a moving a ship. He'd take religious leaders, scientists, and journalists out on a body of water that was suffering from some kind of environmental damage. And I was lucky to be on 2 or 3 of those adventures. and one was on the Baltic Sea, and they were still putting open sewage into certain areas. And he understood that the scientists could give the information, the journalists need to get it out into the world and into the media, and then religious leaders can, you mentioned, Peter, I think you mentioned values. I think that a great many of us share values, and it doesn't matter whether we work in the industrial world or make automobiles or are scientists or spiritual leaders, but we care about each other and we care about the creation and the world. I mean, if we don't have a healthy planet, we don't have healthy people. So the values do come together, but we just go at it from a little, a different way. And I think the success of our friendship is not only because Peter is willing to hang around with an Episcopalian who really does have a strong belief in Christ and God, and that I need his information. So this can happen in all walks of life. I mean, we don't have to all agree on absolutely everything, but we do, if we share values, it's very easy to come together and form a friendship and get something done when we both have the same goal.
Can I just make one more point on this? Because I think it's important to recognize that the getting something done part is essential, right? This is not just about creating space for interesting conversations. It's about creating social change. That's certainly been the frame of reference in which I've thought about my science over the years, and Interfaith Power and Light and Sally's leadership is about leveraging the power of the faith community to make change, to bring about better ways of addressing our relationship to the planet, particularly around climate change. And there are real examples where we've seen, real successes. I think it's undeniable that the passage of legislation nationally this past year under the Inflation Reduction Act came about in no small part because of advocacy from a very diverse set of faith leaders and faith communities concerned lifting up justice as well as facts right into the conversation and into policies in really meaningful ways. Just at COP27, where I was in Sharm el Sheikh in November, the realization after 20 years of effort of the beginning of funding of loss and damage, the harms that vulnerable developing countries have experienced because of changes that they have not caused, has taken root. There's a basis for moving forward now, and the advocacy from faith leaders and youth and indigenous communities and so many voices were really powerful in bringing about that. It was unexpected. It wasn't anticipated. The U.S. and other major governments that are largely influential in these negotiations were not jumping at the opportunity to have this be an outcome. But there's power associated with voices of science and voices of faith speaking together, and I think that's been realized in meaningful ways. There's a lot more to be done, there's no doubt, but it's using our voices to make change in partnership that I think is really what the benefits of this partnership, from my point of view, are where they're most greatly realized.
Thank you for sharing. And we had just had a comment here, which I will share to everyone, related to this point, which is thanks for putting this together, a reminder from Ed Maybach, Center of Climate Change Communication at George Mason University. To encourage uptake of useful behaviors, we recommend making the behaviors easy, fun, and popular. And Joe, thank you for that, because you also shared a link, and I'll send that to all of you on the chat box, which for any of you who are interested in learning more about that information, you have that available for you. But going back to what Peter said, at the end of the day, there has to be change done. There has to be action happening, and there might be some really tough choices that need to be made when having that action done. And that leads to our next question here before we get into the Q&A with the audience, which is, with different knowledges, there is going to be a direction perhaps of hard choices that scientists and faith leaders will face when it comes to climate and environmentalism. What are those moral or environmentally theological perspectives on those morally risky solutions to address these important topics, such as, for example, solar geoengineering, given the less risky approach approaches may not be enough to combat the rising global temperature.
Well, maybe I'll start this off. So this is an area that I spent a lot of time thinking and working and worrying about. There's a lot of exciting progress with clean energy, tremendous progress, and a lot more to come. The technologies and approaches that most of us know and love the most are accelerating in their adoption. Their prices are going down both in the US and internationally, and we're seeing a real transformation of our electricity sector in really important ways, and the movement of electric vehicles and many things that we can point to as signs of progress, as indicators of power and influence that we've had on making change, and as indicators of hope for more to come. And at the same time, of course, fossil fuel emissions continue to rise. Our aspirations, consistent with good science, to stay within a 1.5 degree Celsius increase in global average temperature, confront the fact that the remaining carbon budget associated with that temperature is being whittled away rapidly, and that, sometime in the next several years, if we continue emissions at the level at which we've had, we'll cross that threshold, perhaps even earlier if we have at least on an annual basis, if we have a strong El Nino year and temperature rise spikes. And so we need to confront the fact that we may not stay within the thresholds that we've identified globally, and for good reason, as those that many of us would consider safer, not necessarily safe, but safer. And that has led to many people in the scientific community, at least, and in policy circles, beginning to contemplate, do research on technologies that we really would prefer not to think about. And solar geoengineering is an interesting one. And many people may know it's the idea is that we can mimic volcanoes, essentially, or one version of it, a prominent version, by sending reflecting aerosols into the stratosphere and rapidly cooling the Earth. Technically, we know this is feasible. It may not be terribly costly in a narrow technological sense, but with huge risks and uncertainties and serious problems associated with how one would ever govern such a technology, and legitimate moral, deep ethical questions about who control, is this playing God, right? As many would argue, and how dare we think about the hubris associated with attempting to manage the stratosphere in a way to limit emissions when our inability to manage temperature, when our inability to address the problem in the first place is so manifest. How could we possibly govern these kinds of technologies? And yet we're wrestling with them. Right now, this is being wrestled with largely in the scientific community, with some policymakers. And my own view is that we need to have more voices in this space, and we need to have voices of people who've thought deeply about not only the science, but about the ethical, moral, and societal dimensions of dealing with these technologies. How do we think about this? How do we make choices? Who gets to decide? These are not scientific questions, they're ethical ones. And I really believe the faith community has a very strong role, a necessary role, to play in helping us manage through these sets of questions.
Mm-hmm. I think that's very, very well said, and I can't really add anything to it. I think those are moral decisions that take lots and lots and lots of conversation and lots of voices, and there probably will never be a consensus. But seeding the atmosphere or putting sulfur into the clouds, it's like climate change. I mean, it's like when they used to say that your coal-fired power plant's smoke does not stay in one place. It moves. And that's what will happen with any seeding that's done. It'll move, and it may be beneficial to one area of the world, and it may be really harmful to another. And until those things are figured out and discussed, I just don't think it's at a place where any decision can be made.
Well said. Thank you for that. We have an additional comment that kind of relates to this, which is, as what Peter mentioned, the importance of having everyone at the table for these types of discussions, because there are different ways of knowing, different perspectives, and so the conversations need to happen if we are wanting to make these choices. The comment reads, and thank you, Gail, for this comment. Wonderful webinar. Thank you all for sharing your views and personal stories. a reminder that regarding community volunteering, there are several exciting opportunities to give back and create change on local scale through the American Meteorological Society. I'm going to add this to the chat as well. There is a link available with more information on how folks can volunteer, can have a voice within the AMS to talk about these important topics. And so I'll send that here in a second. Well, we can get started now with the Q&A, and we already have some questions. Again, for the audience, if you have any questions, feel free to add that and we'll address them. The first question comes from Daniel, which reads, as part of the Bishop's Commission on Climate Change in the Diocese of Los Angeles and a deacon at a parish, getting advocacy geared on the parish level has been tough. Can you recommend any starting points, any good starting points?
California Interfaith Power and Light, which is one of the most effective branches of the IPL movement, goes to Sacramento 2 times a year to talk to politicians about different issues from a moral perspective. And as an example of that, years ago, when the standards for automobiles, gas, the miles per gallon for cars, and we worked with Fran Pavley, who was the California senator, to talk to her first from the moral perspective of it, but this was her initiative. And we ended up getting a group of, I think there were maybe 400 or 500 clergy from around the state of California, and we put a big advertisement in the local newspapers, in the Los Angeles Times. And but to get your congregation started on advocacy is to form a team, a green team perhaps, ahead of time, and you'll be surprised how many people will be on that team that are really interested in environmental issues. And even if there's just 4 or 5 that show up, have meetings, talk about what's the most important in your area, sometimes in Oakland, it had to do with big trucks driving through low-income areas and putting too much carbon dioxide and destroying the air. It was air quality. And you get 4 or 5 people together and go visit your legislators, and it's amazing. People like to do that. They feel they're doing something, they're getting involved. And my recommendation would be, find whoever is interested in that congregation. Who are the people there who are actually interested in this subject? And if you start with 2 or 3 people, it will grow. And I would say, take the risk and get that group together and have a meeting and see what happens.
Sorry, I muted myself there. Thank you for that. Peter, I didn't know if you had any other comments. Okay, great. I also added, I added several other resources, including our links. I have a link to several books, for example, and other information on my personal website. Cosmos also has a Google group, which any of you can be a part of to learn about future Cosmos events, as well as future webinars, sessions during the AMS annual meeting, and other initiatives that we have. We'd also love to hear ideas for future events as well. So those are other opportunities. Another one specifically, which was something that we did at the American Meteorological Society, is that we, the National Weather Service has a program called Weather Ready Nation, which is a program that serves businesses, local communities, and now they're wanting to increase their network of houses of worship to have a better tie-in between the local National Weather Service and the houses of worship to which that weather service serves. And if you are interested, feel free to contact me, or I can provide that information too. You would get connected to your local National Weather Service, have information that is really valuable for your local community. And also, being weather ready is being climate ready. As we prepare for, for example, in California, the wildfire, drought, and other issues like that, having the tools and resources available before you through the National Weather Service can also prepare you for the projected future related to our climate. And so I think that is another great example of a connection between what we in the AMS and with the weather water community are doing with local parishes dealing with the local weather, water, climate issues across the country. Great. Okay, so we have another question here. This question, really good question. I am a meteorologist and a climate reporter in the Smoky Mountains, so in the buckle of the Bible Belt. My hometown had the Southeast Baptist largest seminary. How do you recommend touching this topic, I presume climate, on TV when there may not be the appetite for climate/faith? This is a topic that has interested me for years, but we're not in California or Massachusetts. Thank you, Ben, for that question.
Well, I'm happy to take a stab at this. I don't have a crystal ball to know how to meet your community, but obviously, and you know this as a journalist, starting with where people are is always the best place, right? And I don't know what that means in the Smoky Mountains, but if there are weather-related events that are becoming more extreme, for example, and you and others working to communicate the risk of those, perhaps as local meteorologists on TV speaking about the weather. There have been many efforts to provide opportunities for local meteorologists to be able to start with the events that people are experiencing and then connect them softly at first, but persistently and increasingly over time to the fact that they're changing in frequency or severity, and there's a reason for that. It's not random, and scientists have tried to look at this. And you know, that doesn't connect specifically to what faith leaders might do in that space, but maybe Sally has a couple of thoughts of connecting to faith communities that are not themselves ready to speak to climate change as forcefully as they might in California or Massachusetts.
Well, it's hard, and there's no doubt. And I was called a communist. There are plenty of places that didn't like me to speak about climate. When I was down in Georgia, the very first time I went to Georgia to talk about climate change from the pulpit, the priest there, who was very genuinely honest with me, he said, you know, I know this is an issue, but I can't get in the pulpit and talk about it because half my congregants will walk out. So we bring you in from California, and if they like the message, then that's great. Then I can, as the priest here, I can continue on a creation care subject. If they don't like it, then I simply say, yeah, but that's that wacko woman from California. That's what she had to say, and they can dismiss it. But to the question before this one also, I just have to say, don't give up. I mean, there were so many times when I wanted to stop this work, you know, and I thought, why aren't people embracing this subject? Why don't they understand that we're destroying the world and humans are destroying it, and we're God's people, we're God's children. We have to work on this. And I think at some point you get a breakthrough. And that's what happened to me. And then it just soared. The message was readily accepted. And I just think, don't give up. And I mean, and as journalists, Peter, you remember when we used to all complain that the journalists wouldn't talk about climate change? They'd say, we've just had the 4th hurricane, the most serious one that's happened in 100 years. And then they never would say it had anything to do with climate change. And we used to push it. We'd say, why don't you talk about climate change in the media? But there was this worry that, and scientists, I think, you may have even told me this, Peter, no one incident can be labeled a climate change issue. It's the accumulation of it all although I see big changes now. I mean, it seems to me that climate change is something that journalists are willing to talk about. And I hear it on the radio. Of course, I am in California, but I hear it on the radio from, just the reporters. So I think it's changing, and I would have to say, don't give up. Just keep trying in whatever way you think will work, and all of a sudden it'll work. I mean, that's been my experience.
We have a comment that really aligns well with what has just been shared from Joe about what AMS is doing. AMS has been involved with Climate Central, which is an incredible organization that shares wonderful graphics that many TV meteorologists have used. Joe, that's just from my perspective. Joe goes on to say, TV meteorologists the past 10 years have used working with the AMS and Climate Central. Now with over 1,000 TV weathercasters are speaking to climate change. He says in all caps, reach out to your local TV meteorologist who is covering climate, now in over 200 TV markets. In addition, Washington Post now has over 30 reporters covering climate. New York Times, CBS, ABC, NBC, and CNN finally have climate teams covering climate. Keep trying. This is so true. Yeah, never give up. Really important. And there's a question that kind of goes similarly to what you just said, Sally, regarding journalists. AMS, AGU, other academic communities have academic journals. And so this question comes from Wendy Marie Thomas. How can our journals include voices of spirituality? For example, the ethical obligation to gain knowledge, to do so with respect to each other, and to deposit reminders that our spiritual obligation is to protect the earth and not to cause harm nor more of it.
That's true. Is there a question in there?
Oh yeah, I'm sorry. It was at the beginning. How can our journals include voices of spirituality?
But isn't, Carlos, that question's for you, isn't it? Our journal.
Yeah, I was going to say, I can start with that. No, thank you. Yeah. So one of the things that we are working in Cosmos is to develop a manuscript in BAMS, which is the Bulletin of the American Meteorological Society. So that is a scientific journal on this exact topic, on how spiritual and faith-based voices or that way of knowing should be embedded in scientific journals. And that's just one piece of a variety of topics that we will hope to discuss in that manuscript, including K through 12 education. How are we providing a more inclusive environment for students or professionals who have other ways of knowing in the classroom, other spiritual indigenous identities, for example, and knowledge systems, providing spaces for contemplation in the workspace. How are we developing a space where folks can have a space to contemplate, to have their meditative practices, etc., at the National Center for Atmospheric Research, for example, or within the AMS. That's one of the reasons why we developed a quiet and meditation room. So it's really to voice, the idea that there are other ways of knowing, and they are utilized in multiple aspects of the weather, water, climate community. And that's something that we'll be working towards. And hopefully there is more of a recognition that spiritual voices can be included in journals or that way of knowing in addition to the science when discussing these important topics. Mm-hmm. I didn't know, Peter, if you had any other comments.
No, that's great. I really appreciate you sharing that.
Great, yeah. Yeah, thank you. Wendy just said, that's terrific to hear, Carlos. Thank you so much. And again, if you are interested in Cosmos, we love to have anyone be a part of this. You don't have to be spiritually identified. We have folks who are agnostic or atheist, for example, who are allies to this cause, who see the importance of working with spiritual communities, given their importance to society. And it's just like being a part of other affinity spaces that you may not identify with, but you would like to help their cause and their mission. So we have about 5 minutes left. There aren't any other questions I see here. I'll just put one last one to you both before we wrap up, and that is, what advice do you have for youth, specifically when it comes to climate activism, when it comes to environmentalism, when people like myself, for example, who see with both lens, with both my science and my spiritual knowledge, what advice do you have for folks like myself?
Well, that's a big question. Go ahead, Sally.
Well, I was going to say, the one thing I discovered really early on is you can't jam climate change down people's throats. You have to, and Peter said this earlier, you have to be where they are. And everybody wants clean air. Everybody wants their children to be able to go outside and play baseball or football and not have asthma attacks because the air quality is bad. There are all these things that we really agree on, and those are the places to start when you're talking to others about the climate issue. And I did make some mistakes. I would get in the pulpit and tell everybody that the climate was changing and we were doing it, and they had to get out of their big cars. And if they didn't, and I had people come up to me and say, I have to have a big SUV. I've got 4 children and I've got surfboards and I've got stuff that has to go in the car. And then I would tell them they were sinners because they knew better. And I learned very quickly that you have to go very gently on this subject in order not to have people just turn their back and go the other way. And you start with what we have in common. And that's, I can't imagine that someone would say, well, I don't care about the environment. Maybe there are folks who let their politics or their financial interests get in the way of their faith or their values, because I think the values can get disrupted, and the values can just be liquefied by money. And it's patience, and it's gentleness, and it's listening to where they are, listen to the other person. And then, maybe you have to go away and come back in 4 or 5 days and get on that subject again. But I would simply say that patience and, loving your neighbor is a wonderful thing to keep in mind, that if someone's disagreeing with you or thinking that climate's not a problem, or we didn't cause it, or people aren't causing it, what do they think might be causing it? Or do they just think that, I've heard God wouldn't let anything happen to the world. God created the world, gave his only son because he loves it so much, and would never let anything happen to creation. Well, we know that that's probably not true. I don't think that God, never mind, I'm going down a trail I don't want to go down. Peter, what do you have to say about this?
Well, you're a tough act to follow, Sally. I know we just have a few minutes left. I think what you said earlier about don't give up is a really good place to end. It's a lot better than Don't Look Up, which was the title of a movie that we should be looking up, right? But we shouldn't be giving up. And I've been very inspired by my interactions with early career scientists from much more diverse backgrounds than was in my space when I was an early career scientist. I'm excited by the expansion of voices and perspectives in the scientific community that are working on climate change and bringing a range of perspectives and cultural and personal histories and sensibilities and lenses to the climate fight. We can't give up. It's obviously easy, not easy, but it's understandable to turn to moments of despair, and faith communities have a lot to teach us, I think, about how to work through acknowledging the kind of the really hard things that we're facing in a disruptive climate, and how to kind of find ways to sit with that and acknowledge it, but not give up. In my own faith tradition in Judaism, one of the things I think resonated with me most is a saying from, I think it's the Mishnah, which are these oral traditions dating back thousands of years about, we are not obligated to finish the task, but neither are we free to desist from it. That is to say, I'm not going to, in my lifetime, climate change is not going to be solved, but I have a responsibility and an opportunity to kind of continue to stick at it, to continue to work and fight and bring good science in partnership with others, and to make sure I'm passing the baton to others who can lift their voices up and continue not to desist from the task along with us and after us. And that gives me a lot of hope and agency to know that there are others coming, following in our footsteps and building even stronger communities of practice at this nexus. And so maybe I'll just leave it there.
Yeah, hope. That sounds wonderful. Thank you both so much. We're out of time here, but I would like to extend my warm thanks to both of you for what has been such a really wonderful conversation, a needed conversation, and the value and the importance of this type of work and this type of relationship with spiritual faith-based voices and scientists moving to be active when it comes to environmentalism and related topics. So with that, I will let everyone go. Again, we just, on behalf of AMS, thank you both. Again, I sent out the resources on the chat so that if you are interested in reaching out to any of us, as well as more information on Cosmos, you have that available before you. So with that, thank you again. Thank you, Sally. Thank you, Peter. I hope everyone has a great rest of their day. And yeah, thank you again.
Okay, thank you, Carlos. Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.